Good morning. I am Kim Miner with Tableau, and I have the great pleasure today of introducing our two speakers from Visa. I think you'll find this presentation extremely interesting because today we have Rick Fisher, who is from the risk group at Visa, and his partner in crime, Mark Dunlap from Client Analytics. So with that, gentlemen, I'll turn it over to you, and we will handle Q&A at the end.
Thanks. Based on looking around the room, I think everyone thought Morgan Freeman was going to be here, but it's me instead. You're stuck. So let's go ahead and get started. I guess a couple of things. When I think about these presentations, I tend to think there's some of them where it's like, here's a really cool new functionality. Hopefully we'll have a couple of things at the end that are useful tips and tricks. And then there's a few where we all kind of get together and have a group hug about like this problem that we've been trying to solve, and lo and behold, everybody has the same one. And so that's what we're going to focus on a little bit here. Just kind of one of your traditional bottleneck problems, getting data to the front, getting insight to the front, and trying to spread as much knowledge as possible throughout the organization. So like Kim said, I'm Mark Dunlap. I'm on the Client Analytics team. What that means is that I'm a part of our client services organization, and I partner with primarily issuing banks, but the organization partners with all of the different banks who are our clients to help kind of dig through the mountain of data that comes through the Visa network and try and uncover any sort of insights that we can, look for opportunities to improve how well the entire payment system is working. And
I'm Rick Fisher. I'm with the Visa DPS, and we'll explain that later on, but DPS risk product team involved in helping to identify and deploy solutions to target fraud among our population of issuing bank clients, of which there are several hundred.
All right, so quick agenda. So first we're going to go through who we are, and I don't mean just repeat the exact same thing you just heard. I'm going to go into a little bit more about actually who Visa is. I know it's a name that everyone pretty much recognizes, but you'd be amazed at the number of times that you'll get in a conversation and have a little bit of a misperception around what it is we do. And so we'll go through that. We'll also talk a little bit about who Visa Debit Processing Services, Visa DPS is, which is what Rick mentioned. Then Rick's going to run through a little bit of the fraud prevention landscape, and then we'll get to what the problem is that we're solving with Tableau. Then I'm going to step back up and do a little bit of a demo of a dashboard we put together. Live demo, and then also go through some tips and tricks, things that we learned while designing this, with a little bit of a couple of calculations and things that we did at the end. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So starting with who we are, Visa issues credit cards, right? Yes. Wrong. Visa issues debit cards, right? No. Let's kind of start. Mark raises the point. There's some misunderstandings. Visa is really an enabler of the payment landscape, and we do this through what we call the four-party model. There are 4 parties involved in payment transactions, starting with the cardholder. That would be you in the room. If you've got a Visa card or if you have another payment card, you're the cardholder. And then you interact with a merchant. That merchant can be a physical merchant. When you go to the store, it can be a card not present merchant, we call it. That's kind of inside lingo, but that means e-commerce. That means buying on a merchant through your phone or through your laptop. So there's different worlds of merchants, and that world is evolving very quickly. And then there's the acquiring bank. That's really the bank that the merchant interacts with. And then the issuing bank. So that's the four-party model, cardholder to merchant to acquiring bank. And acquiring is where the merchant interacts through the networks to the issuing bank, get authorization for transactions, et cetera. And I just want to kind of point out the issuing bank then ties back to the cardholder. That's where that cardholder relationship is. So that kind of brings the whole full circle. Visa is in that network, but Visa does not issue that card. Another institution will issue that card, not Visa. But ultimately, Visa is really trying to connect the electronic payments networks, and Visa DPS is really an enabler of that payments network to bring in that relationship with the issuing institution through those networks. Let's kind of unpack this a little bit. The cardholder, as I mentioned, interacts with the merchant, and the merchant interacts with their acquiring bank. That's the transaction processing between merchant and the payment network. That acquiring bank then routes the network transaction activity out into the network. In this case, we're showing Visa, but there are a number of payment networks, Visa being the network that we are involved with, but we also support a number of other networks, and then that network, Visa in this case, interacts with the issuing bank. Visa DPS comes in the middle of the network and the issuing bank. So Visa DPS is a processing entity that enables the issuing bank, the bank you have your card with, to interact with those payment networks. And so that's really kind of where we fit in terms of this whole payment ecosystem, we call it. So anyway, that's kind of the four-party model and where all the different pieces fit together. Now, in terms of the landscape, we've got fraud is kind of a big topic in the industry and among consumers in the news, in the legislative environments. There are lots of different flavors of fraud, but it's a very quickly changing environment, and it requires different solutions, challenging solutions. Each time we confront a new problem, we develop new solutions, or perhaps we anticipate new problems and develop preemptory solutions. There are several different flavors of fraud, and that's kind of my area of focus. There's e-commerce fraud, that's remote payments, that's the card-not-present merchants that I touched on a few minutes ago. That's somebody utilizing your payment credentials to get something from a merchant that's not where you're not physically present. There's counterfeit fraud. That's probably what you're most familiar with if your card has been exposed through a data breach or through some sort of a compromise event. That card information can be replicated in the form of a counterfeit card and used to make point-of-sale purchases at the physical location. Lost and stolen fraud is another variation. If you lose your card or if it's stolen out of your hotel room or your wallet or what have you, that's another way that fraud can manifest itself. And then a fourth category is called account takeover. That's really where the bad guys, the crooks, are impersonating the cardholder, taking over the account or its credentials or its payment devices, whether it's a card or other payment mechanisms, to commit fraud. Now, all of those channels have different solution sets that are available to combat. We're going to kind of highlight some of these. So there's a whole bunch of different things going on in the marketplace. I'm going to call out a few of them. In the e-commerce world, the card-not-present world, one of the very significant innovations is something we call tokenization. In many cases, if you interact with one of the payment devices on your phone, Apple Pay or Samsung Pay or any of those, your card number is typically not even stored on your phone. It's not there. What is instead stored is what's called a token, and we call that tokenization. So the token looks an awful lot like a card number. It has the same characteristics, but it's uniquely delivered to only allow payments from that device. So if your phone is stolen and the crook can get past the biometrics, that phone and only that phone can be used, but they can't typically get past the biometrics. But if that token that's stored on the device is compromised and whatever, it cannot be used anywhere else outside of that device. That same concept is in deployment among a number of other different channels as well. But in essence, the sort of premise is devaluing the data. The card number, and you'll see as we go forward, the card number is going to become less an important piece of the part of the puzzle when you're making purchases, because that's we're devaluing that through things like tokenization. There's obviously transaction alerts. Probably many of you in this room get notifications when your card is used to make purchases exceeding a certain amount or with a certain characteristic. Lots of ways that we can bring you closer to the action as a cardholder, and we can bring our issuing institutions closer to the action in terms of notification and prevention. In the card-present counterfeit fraud world, the EMV chip is perhaps one of the most significant innovations, and I would imagine most of you have cards with EMV chips on them. That's a very difficult technology to crack if you're a crook. The magnetic stripe has been historically fairly, I don't want to say easy, but it's not as secure. An EMV chip is much more secure. It involves some encryption and some algorithms and keys and all those kinds of things. But it makes our card-present counterfeit fraud much more difficult to commit. There's a whole number of other technologies and devices available to combat each of these different categories of fraud. Some of them working independently, some of them working in collaboration, but all working toward bringing fraud as a threat point of the payments ecosystem down. And that's really what our role is all about. So what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Simply put, the problem is we know a lot about fraud. We know a lot about where it's coming from, what its characteristics are, how we can defend against it. We know that through billions of transactions. So we see and have access to all kinds of information that can be then harvested and deployed to identify what the right solution set is, or even if there is a problem. Historically, we've accessed that information through a series of queries or data pulls answering a specific question for a specific entity. In our case, it's the issuing institution. But that is challenging. We have a bottleneck, and that bottleneck is people like me. There's only so many of me's running around. And so what we've found is if we sort of do a threat matrix and we look at which institutions are having a problem, we might be slow in identifying that threat because we just don't see it or it's not prioritized to us. So where our challenge is getting that information quickly, leveraging it across scale, and distributing out to the closest points of taking action. All of those tools and those techniques and those fraud prevention capabilities that we talked about a minute ago, those are essentially all of our issuing institutions, the banks and credit unions and financial institutions that issue your Visa card, they make individual decisions on which of those of the menu that they want to take advantage of. We don't force many of these solutions onto the issuing institutions, but we want to give them access to know this is the tool available to you, this is the problem profile, and this is your solution set that you can take advantage of. Challenge is, if we have a funnel or a bottleneck, we can't get that information out fast enough. We lack leverage. So if it all has to go through one or two or three or a handful of people that are looking for outlier information, we may miss one that we just didn't have a chance to get to. Or we may have a prioritization problem where the biggest fish gets the most attention, but is maybe not having the biggest problem. So ultimately, our challenge was to come up with a model to harvest all this data, to build it into a capability for us to not me see the problem, but push the distribution out of the solutions and the visibility into that problem across a wide array. In our world, we have what we call account managers. Those are individuals who work with client financial institutions, and then the financial institutions behind them. If we can leverage information and leverage the ability to send a lot of information out across a wide network, we can get the action pulling into us and finding the solutions for them to take advantage of without us having to see, convey, communicate, and encourage participation. So that was kind of our challenge, and that's where we partnered with our data analytics folks. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark to kind of go through how we built up those solution sets.
Thanks. Okay, just give me 1 second while I jump over to the dashboard demonstration. All right, so as I'm pulling this up, a couple of different disclaimers for you. So you'll notice in here some of these trends look a little bit odd. It's because I made up all of the data. Not something that we're going to be able to share, anything about the actual payment volumes flowing through, the fraud rates relative to them, certainly not any sort of actual client data. And so this is all a product of me. So if you see something that just looks a little bizarre, it's because coming up with a data set to mimic something that was millions of rows long was a little bit of more of an exercise than I was able to make look completely natural. But anyway, so what we've got here is a look at a dashboard that we deployed on Tableau Server. Like Rick said, there's a huge amount of technology deployed stopping fraud. What we were really trying to do here is identify the points of leakage. When you think about fraud rates in the basis point range, really low, but it's still there and it's still meaningful money when you're talking about billions of dollars, trillions of dollars flying across a network. And so this is a way that we can help to identify those points of leakage and try to adopt or try to create new technologies to combat fraud in a more systemic way. So like I said, this is something that we deployed on a Tableau Server instance internally. And I'll give a very quick run through of what's on here, but more importantly, I think to this room is the way that I tried to put it together. So first couple of things, we did try to design it where, again, it's sort of a pull model where an account manager can log directly in. They can look at whichever institution they want. and toggle between. You'll notice the numbers change, the trends don't. This is what I was talking about the boring data. They can take a look at different products. So I just created some debit data here, but we've got debit, credit, prepaid, and you can look at any of these. And like Rick mentioned, one of the first things that he would always look at whenever we get a question from a client is, first off, is there a problem? And so this first slide is really intended to answer the question, is there a problem? We've got a couple of things. So you've got your fraud rates here, and we tried to design these all to be interactive and intuitive. So we start off with just a fraud amount, and one little tip of something that we found to be very useful is, rather than having a definitions or a business data dictionary, just using the tooltips to say what it is we're looking at here. This is your confirmed fraud and what the data source is. And then taking a look at payment volume, and we say, oh, this is our, what our payment volume is, our definition of what we're looking at. Throwing in the calculations we're using. Just trying to make it as simple as possible so that people don't have to know both where to go to get it and then who to ask if they have a question. And then you can get down to your trends. If you wanted to zoom in on a specific month, we tried to build something where it would update our numbers here. And then also starting to look at a couple of the very first sort of points of defense. Like Rick mentioned, one of the biggest things that institutions are doing right now to fight fraud is making sure that EMV chip cards are deployed. And so this is one of the views we've got. It's just an EMV migration rate that goes across. And one of the first things we'll look at is, if you haven't introduced EMV cards, and you've got a fraud issue, that may be your solution right there. And then, what we do typically see is that as people deploy these EMV cards, you tend to see this drop in fraud rate. But even before we start talking about that, there's the other thing, which is, do we have a problem at all? Now this is probably the prime example of the fallacies of made-up data. You can barely see here that we've got two lines. One of them is a benchmark that we'll show. So, a lot of times you'll see a blip in fraud, and so someone will say, we've got a major problem, and then we'll go and look and say, well, I don't know, you're actually a quarter of what we see on average, so we certainly want to address that problem, but have you considered focusing on these other things? Or, yeah, indeed, you do have a problem. Let's get to the bottom of it. And so just being able to make this, rather than needing to absorb multiple charts, just have it be something where an account manager can jump back and forth, compare what they're looking at. But then you still run into these situations where people have questions. So the first thing we wanted to do was, again, take advantage of some tooltips. This is just a dashboard with an image in it and a tooltip where we can tell people a little bit about how it works. If you can't see it up there, it just says click on things. It's interactive. This is a new thing that we're rolling out. It's not Excel, it's not PowerPoint, it's not a PDF. It's interactive. Try to work with it and see what you can uncover, see what questions it raises. Use the drop downs to filter. Click on charts, unclick them if you want to unhighlight, and then check out an FAQ tab, which we put together, which is, what does it do? This was one of our things that came up when we were piloting this. Is traditionally people have gone to the subject matter experts like Rick, and they've asked a question, or they've said, so and so has a question. Can we talk about it? And so even switching, one of the barriers to entry on Tableau, it's not really that Tableau is hard. It's that people aren't used to thinking, what am I supposed to even be looking for in this? They're used to having someone say, here is a chart. This is what it tells you. And so we tried to just line out, here's some questions. Do you have a problem? How does my fraud performance compare to benchmarks? How are we doing on EMV migration rates? What type of fraud? And I'll show you a few examples of that. And then sort of the final thing, because we don't want to make this into a really sterile, no interaction model, is that we still want to have people have the ability to get to us. I'm not going to click this because it's going to make me authenticate my email and all sorts of stuff for security purposes. But what it is if you click this, it's a URL action on the dashboard that will pop up an email. We've got some content in it that says, if you're working with these clients, reach out to this person, so and so, so on and so forth, so that they can just immediately have the subject line populated with the client they're looking at. They can type in and say, hey, got a question about this, fire it off, and then we can immediately get back to them with, okay, let's dig into more detail than what you can get using this dashboard.
And with this one example, we have answered 60–70% of the challenges, and we've distributed out to those institutions and those entities with them having not have to have the level of knowledge or the familiarity. They've got that information right there, so they can solve for us. Who is the one that needs the attention? Where are the problems? So it's really greatly increased our leverage and our clients' ability to quickly respond and identify where there's a problem.
So the other thing, that first dashboard, it's good information. It's good to just kind of look at it. But the other thing that we wanted to do was, in effect, build almost like a triage tool, is the way I think of it. Again, we aren't expecting every single person at Visa to have the level of expertise as someone like Rick, who's spent a career learning about risk and fraud. But we do want people to get a better idea of where they may be having an issue. And so this is just a little bit of a different view. It's the same information across the top, same tooltips, everything here. But it really starts to break down not just the rates like you saw on the first tab, but getting a look at just the amounts going on, a little bit of a distribution by the type so that you can look at it and see, is this something related to counterfeit fraud? That could be related to the EMV migration if you didn't have that going, or is it related to something else? And then also get a bit of use this same functionality of changing the chart so that people don't have to digest a new chart, they just digest new information, to toggle between different things. So we could look at whether it's card present or card not present, and it's all relative to here. And say you want to know, oh, this looks like it's getting bigger on card not present. You click onto it, and then you see actually that, well, it's grown a little bit in the middle part of the last 12 months, but then it's starting to tail off a little more recently. So as a percentage of the total, it may appear to be growing, but actually the fraud rate, if you remember from the first slide, was decreasing. So just a little bit of a chance to look at this, get a sense of how much volume, how much fraud you're getting in certain areas. Same sort of thing with looking at usage type or network. As Rick mentioned, since we're on the DPS side, we actually work with more networks than just Visa. Visa's the primary one, but we can look at it and say, we need to dig into traffic coming through such and such network because, it looks like that's being targeted by some crooks somewhere. Or, this is not the case, but maybe it's something with ATM. You've got some sort of an issue related to your cash cards that you need to do something about, or signature transactions. Take a look at domestic international. And like Rick mentioned, that accomplishes a really good chunk of what the questions coming in from our clients were. They would start out at the 6 to 8 questions that he was answering for every single client, and a lot of people, they say, okay, that's great, that's all I really needed to know. And then occasionally you come across something that really is a blip, some new type of fraud that's starting to poke up or appear, and so we can get to it faster because we're not having the subject matter experts spending all of their time digging in to just answering the basics.
And ultimately what we've done is separated the information, the diagnostics, from the tools to get there. All you need to be able to do to see whether you have a problem, and if so, what that problem is, and therefore what those solutions are, is to be able to pick a name from a drop-down list and then identify the nature of the problem. So it takes, instead of having to distribute expertise and technology solutions, we distribute this solution out to a broad range and give immediate and actionable information on demand with no need to link up to the data sources, to synthesize the data, to build the outputs, and to develop those kind of critical analytics insights.
Yep. And so I'll go back into a couple of the things. There are a few things that may or may not be useful for you on the Tableau front, and I'll go into a couple of those in a minute. But just to kind of get back to what it is we were trying to do. So you may remember from the other slide, the issue was we were having a bit of a bottleneck. And so what we did is we tried to change the paradigm. Basically, we're still using the same data. We've got the billions of transactions. We do have some of your traditional kind of legacy BI architecture where you're using the standard format report that needs to be joined in with the data that we've got in our Hadoop clusters. And so we take both of those, and rather than have it be only able to use the reports, only Rick working on it, it's really been an excellent chance for collaboration across two different parts of the organization where he knows about fraud, I know more about working with data, presenting it in a visual, engaging way, and so we create this dashboard. But then that's not where it ends because we don't want it to be the only source of information. We don't want to remove the subject matter experts out of the loop. That's not going to solve the problem long term. just disengaging and not asking the next question and saying, got the dashboard, that's all you need. And so that is really the first line of defense, and then the second is that they can come back to us and we have more time to spend digging deep. And so that's kind of how I think about the paradigm of what we're trying to do by deploying these dashboards in a server environment to a large number of not terribly analytic people who know how to understand data, but they don't necessarily know how to work with it and build things with it. One of the really important things on that, so I'm going to go into a little bit of what's under the hood here. As we were getting into this, a lot of what we had initially started out a couple of years ago on was putting together these sorts of dashboards that were really interactive, and they allowed you to bring in a huge amount of different dimensions and really explore your data. And that was really great when it was our client analytics team working on it. It was really great when it was someone like Rick who works with Tableau and knows the product and kind of can look at the data and realize this is meaningful, this isn't. But when we're talking about presenting something to a really broad audience, it was very important to us to do a lot of pre-processing on the data and really think through what is important. How do we need to present this? Who are we presenting it to? What's their level of understanding? How do we make it as clear as possible? And so that's where we do a lot of processing outside of Tableau too, to just make sure that we compress all of these billions of transactions into a scalable, usable format. So we've got our standard BI reporting that we drop into some HDFS tables in Hive or using Hive. We've got our HDFS tables that contain a lot of information. And for this particular use case, what we really tried to do is, since we're trying to make this as simple as possible, we did a lot of the pre-processing with some Uzi workflows to where it'll manipulate all the data, put it into basically another HDFS table that we'll use as the source for our TDEs, and then we'll refresh our TDEs as we bring in new data, work with that in desktop where we need to, if we need to make any tweaks or changes, and then publish it up to Tableau Server. And then also being able to control our own access to Tableau Server so that all the right people get access to the information, but it's not just sitting out there on a server for anyone to download that they want. It's important still to make sure that the data is safe and that it's something, even when it's aggregated, that's being exposed to the right group of people. And so being able to control the access to it on Tableau Server as opposed to firing things out over email, even if they're encrypted emails, you've lost control of it, you don't know where it's going to go. And so it's a much, much safer environment for us to share the information. So a couple of tips and tricks. I mentioned I was going to go into a few things that I thought were interesting. So one thing is scalable axes. So this is something that I don't know if you picked up on. Let me flip back over here. So in our dashboard, on the first one, you notice that there's this toggle between two scales. You probably also noticed that there's no numbers on the right, and so there's probably like 40% of you in here who are like, who are these jerks talking to me about data, and they didn't even label their axes. What the heck are we looking at? That's actually part of something that we did with our scalable axes. So our problem is that we're trying to compare metrics with really, really, really different scales. And so, in this case, 90% versus 5 basis points. Or our other comparison, in this case, also 5 basis points to 5 basis points. But even if you're talking 6 or 8 or 4 or 3 or whatever, they're in the same ballpark. So the really simple thing that we tried to do at first was just to not fix our axes. Because what happens if you sync your axes is this. Let's see if this will load up. I've got a broken version. So when you sync your axes, you've got a situation where your EMV migration rate that is orders of magnitude larger than your first comparison, it renders this other set of data meaningless. It just turns it into a flat line. Same thing would happen if you were trying to compare to something really small versus something really big. It's just not useful. So if you sync them, then they'll line up pretty closely to what we had on the first page. But then when they're synced, when you bring it to something like this, what you end up with, they work for the EMV migration rate, but when you flip, again, I wish this was a little bit better example. If you have like laser eyes, you might be able to see that these are slightly closer together. But what really happens is if you're looking at something like 5 basis points compared to 8 basis points and the ranges don't vary a lot, they get smashed together because your axes are trying to make the data fit onto a similar scale, and you can lead to some really incorrect conclusions where, you know, it looks like it's always right around the range of the benchmark, even if it may be double or half the benchmark. And so what we did is we had a couple of calculations to basically just line our data up and create some numbers. The numbers actually feeding these lines don't represent what's going on. They're not the real numbers. They represent the real relative numbers, but they don't represent the actual numbers. And then we were bringing the labels back. And so I'm going to show you a little bit about that. Apparently too much up and down here. So, one moment. Let's just do this in a pocket. Like I said, scaling axes, different magnitudes. Got our big disclaimer at the bottom. Rick was trying to read this really fast, but we decided that we would just let you read it yourself. So this is not for you know, use at your own risk. This is not Visa endorsed. This is Mark endorsed, and you know, take it for what you will. You've only known me for about 35 minutes. But what we did is we did a couple of different level of detail calculations. So the first thing we did is we determined the primary metric, so the thing that we want to be the focus, and we need to get a level of detail to calculate it. And so what you see here in the box is a formula that returns the maximum fraud rate locked at the level of the client for the month and for the product, in that case, credit, debit, you know, whatever it is. So why did I fix this calculation? The main reason is that in order to scale this data, you need the maximum of your primary metric to get an idea of where you're going to. So that would be, you could just use a max if you've got one record for every one of these combinations. But the issue we run into is we've got more than one record back there. So we start throwing in a max function. It's going to bring us back the max of kind of who knows what, whatever the random data record is in there. And so what we do is we fix our level of detail, and then we calculate the max. So we know that we want the max for a given issue or a given product type, and you want it at the level of detail a month. You figure out what your biggest month is. Then what we do is we actually exclude the month, because we've got, you know, the max each month. We need to get rid of it so we get the max across the 12-month period. So we exclude month, determine what the maximum fraud rate is for the entire 12 months. And you know, the order of operations is pretty important on level of detail. If you haven't worked with these before, one thing I would caution you about is make sure you get a little bit more familiar with your order of operations, with your filter orders, because fixed and things like exclude and include work at different points, and so you can get some kind of funny looking numbers if you're not putting them in the right place. But anyway, you've got your external after, so that you make sure you just exclude your month. We throw in a null zero function so that we don't have a bunch of null values. And then what we're doing from there is basically simple arithmetic. So we've got our primary metric maximum, and we use that to scale our other metric. So you know, in this case, we're wanting to scale down a larger number. So basically, we can take this number that's a basis point number, a basis point number, and then we can multiply it by our larger number, shrink it down, get them onto a similar relative scale. You'll probably need to adjust your arithmetic according to whatever use case you've got here. And then since it's a toggleable filter, the other one, the metrics were actually pretty close, so we didn't need to scale them. And so we just have a, you know, if this, bring back the scaled metric, otherwise bring back the other one. So what we've done is we've effectively just made up imaginary numbers for our rates. So if you show labels, it's going to show EMV migration rate of, you know, 9 basis points or something, which is not true. It's a 90%. And so then what we do is we bring in a fraud rate comparison label. So when you see those labels, I'm not going to bend down and flip back and forth for fear of exploding my microphone again. But when you see those labels, it shows, you know, 90% EMV migration rate. It shows what the real one is. And so really all we do is just create a label calculation that we then drop in. So even though we've got numbers that aren't represented, we hide the axis, you don't see it there. You add labels so that you can still understand what's going on. And you put that there. And like I mentioned, you know, you're hiding your axis, so make sure you have very, very clear labeling. You don't want to just leave it out there because it won't really mean a whole lot of things. So make sure you get your maximum and your minimum in there at least so that you've got a range. make sure that it's pretty clear by color which one is which, so that it's, you're able to follow what the data is. And then, kind of at the end, this is just a couple of tips. I can't claim to be like a visual design guru or anything like that. This is really just stuff that kind of came to mind when I was thinking about my experience building this. Like I said, we're building it for people who aren't necessarily familiar with Tableau. They aren't necessarily familiar with cutting and, kind of manipulating data to get a better understanding. And so, a couple of things we did. We wanted to make sure that our dimensions were ranged because we're putting it on a server and we don't know what type of machine people are looking at. We've got, laptops, we've got desktops, we've got that weird Windows zoom feature that just makes things 50% bigger arbitrarily in some windows. So we tried to make it as flexible as possible, knowing that we aren't going to hit every single use case, but using our range dimensions. We used the parameters to toggle metrics to save real estate. We're trying to make this thing simple. We want only a few charts on each page, maybe 1 or 2 even. And we do still need to answer 5 or 10 questions. And so having the parameters so that you can choose what it is you want to look at and then flip the actual view, that was very valuable in terms of making a clean dashboard that made good use of the real estate. The big numbers, I think that's been a theme throughout the week, but drawing the attention to the data, not to the headers. Make sure that you explain what the data is, but make sure people are focusing on the data. Taking advantage of the tooltips. This is something that I think a lot of people do already. It was, frankly, moderately new to me because most of the time I work in Tableau, it's working with data for myself that I'm then presenting. And so I had to really stop and think about a good use of tooltips because I'm not going to be there to hold hands with whoever is running through it every single time. And then guiding people on the questions to ask, whether that's in the front tab, whether that's in a back tab, whether it's in a window there that says this is intended to show you it. It might be in your title, it might be in your chart headers, whatever the case may be, but just tell people what it is they're supposed to be taking away from this. And with that, I think that sort of brings us to the end of the content, but we do have some time for questions. I think we're about 40 minutes in, so plenty of time for questions if anyone has any. Yeah. No, that actually...
Repeat the question.
Oh, yeah, repeat the question. So what he asked was on the charts we showed, and I may be able to flip back over. On the charts we showed, I may have run out my welcome with the technology. Here we go. We've got this gray area. What this is, he asked what this is it a forecast? What this actually is it's a window where we want to make people aware that the data could change. So what happens with fraud is, it's not like it's reported or captured right at the minute it happens. I had a couple of days lag. I actually got a vending machine pinged the other day on my corporate card. And they called me and said, it looks like there's something going on, and they didn't get a chance to respond immediately. So there's a 90-day window where you can report fraud on a card, and this is just intended to make sure people remember that these numbers aren't final, that they could change. Yeah? Do you want to take that one?
Okay, so the question was, how do biometric tools like fingerprint and voice recognition come into play in prevention of fraud? So in the case of the consumer, yes, it's access. So you have biometrics to access a payment vehicle. In the case of interactions through a call center application, you have authentication through voice ID. In case of access through other methods, you have different authentication, one-time password types of things. So different tools to authenticate different use cases or different interactions is really kind of how we focus on that. And those, again, are used to greatly varying degrees by individual institutions and our clients. So we have them available. The question is that something that becomes important to leverage? And what then, how can we best, in essence, like the beauty of this whole thing is I know the things that I know about fraud. Mark knows a great deal about Tableau. We have a lot of client-facing institutions that are not nearly as about leveraging the data, democratizing the data, and distributing out there so that the consumer of that information is not having to be expert in all these things to get it to them. We have experts to do that, and we have quasi-experts in my case to sort of help construct what it is that needs to be viewed, and then that exposes what those challenges are, those areas of opportunity. So the answer to your question simply is it's just how we interact with the cardholder and how we authenticate that interaction. But at the end of the day, we're looking to see whether that is an area of need in terms of what the exposure is. Lost or stolen fraud is typically a fairly small percentage of the overall fraud picture. So authentication of that cardholder may not be as big of a priority as something like counterfeit fraud, which an EMV chip is very successful at solving. So we're trying to focus attention on competing resources to deliver the best and most productive or value-enriching solutions based on the problems that are being seen and the experience and the data that we can see, but historically have been challenged to enable others to access without this leveraged and distributed, democratized model.
And on the sort of ease of use front, I mean, we focused a lot on fraud today, but it's really important also. We want to be the preferred way to pay and be paid for everyone. So it is important to make sure that this is user-friendly. It's pretty hard to tell people that it's great to use a card if it's 100% locked down and every single time you get a phone call and everything like that. So the goal is to balance the effective fraud solutions, and biometrics, for example, are a way that it can be pretty easy to interact with, but it's also a fairly good security method to kind of get the best of both worlds.
Over here.
Where? Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you've had any experience using Tableau for real-time or near real-time fraud detection?
So the question is whether we've had any experience using Tableau for real-time or near real-time fraud protection. I have not personally had any experience doing that. The reality is that a lot of the, like you saw, is that there's a huge array and a wide kind of net of services preventing fraud. And a lot of those are systemic and intended to be used in mere seconds. I think the numbers you see, if you go look on YouTube for the thing, it's like a transaction that bounces from Brazil to the US back to China where the card is from and gets diverted because of a magnetic storm and this, that, and the other, and it takes a second and a half, and really it's less than a second. And so, even if we can get the data real time into Tableau, it's not like we're gonna have a bunch of people sitting there looking at it come in and furiously punching buttons to indicate whether something's fraud or not. But it is something where, I think the real-time streaming capabilities of some of the different data sources, whether it's like Spark or something in our Hadoop cluster, could potentially be really powerful with that to help us speed up this model, which is, again, looking for leakage and doing it on a daily basis or an hourly basis as opposed to a weekly, monthly basis.
And let me just follow up. Important point of clarification. There's a lot of stuff that happens in real time in the transaction flow between merchant and financial institution. So don't want anybody to take away that we're not taking action in real time. That is very much not the case. But in terms of bringing closer to the event the fraud profiles, that is an evolving process, and we are moving in that direction in terms of both real-time identification of fraud and that then informing what the threat matrix is, what the solution strategies are, what the alternatives are. So we're building that real-time access to the transaction activity for purposes of leveraging in the Tableau solution. Now, we cannot, I don't want to say cannot, we would be challenged to get into the transaction stream because that is, microseconds are critical in that transaction flow. So that's probably not where we're going to focus most of our attention. Instead, we're going to focus on rapid identification of what is happening for purposes of identifying that solution that's available to target that activity.
Got one here.
Do you guys do any kind of alerting or anomaly detection out of here that would, instead of having the sort of the client user have to dig through the set of dimensions to find, the interesting event that would surface to them, hey, across this set of dimensions, there's some interesting pattern you should look at.
Mm-hmm. So the question was, do we do any sort of alerting or sort of data-driven raise the flag as opposed to having people dig through. So right now, this is not developed to do that. We actually just switched over to 10.3, I think a few weeks ago. So we, make sure that everything is pretty darn safe before it goes into the ecosystem. And so alerts are definitely something that we're looking into because, again, hundreds of clients in the case of DPS, thousands for Visa, and so. Even if we can have something that's really fast to flip, it's still thousands to flip through. So yeah, the ability to get some alerts would be very powerful.
One additional point of clarification that this particular application is really diagnostic at the high level. Do I have a problem? Triaging. Do I have a problem? And if so, where might I find the solution? The next level of diving is going into much more detailed targets of opportunity, whether it's a counterfeit EMV, what's called fallback, or whether it's a card authentication through the card not present, electronic commerce channels. All of those, instead of trying to throw everything out there at once, we say, is there a problem? Or we actually let the client or the client's representative determine if there's a problem. And if so, point to where to look for the solution. And that's the next rollout of this, which we don't have here today to present.
So we've got one here and then one here. So, yep.
I think you sort of answered my question. I was going to ask if you had any connections to transactional level data. So for example, you have some aggregate charts and like an investigator maybe wants to deep dive into the transactions. Do you have any capabilities like that currently with Tableau?
We do. The question is, there are, these charts showed aggregate level information, but do we have any sort of access to transaction level data so that we can do the deep dive and understand what's going on? And the answer is yes. And that's something that we do have, kind of our team, we have a lot of people working in kind of the combination of our Hadoop cluster and connecting Tableau directly to it to help sort of diagnose what's going on. But yeah, that, we've got tables that, they've got billions of records and are, however many terabytes or petabytes they are. And so to put that in Tableau, what happens is we need to use something like this to help diagnose where the area might be, and then we can go pull out the individual transactions, just because, if we connect our Tableau dashboards directly to, 150 billion records, it's gonna be a little bit tough to derive a huge amount of insight.
But it's exactly that transaction level that informs the next layer of defenses. Mm-hmm. Seeing what's going on in a segment, in a category, in a usage type, in a country, all of those different dimensions, we can see broadly through the diagnostic level, and then we bore down analytically through tools in Tableau to get to the solution specifically. So I have a problem here, and this is the sort of roster of cures that are available to me. I will go forward with those cures. I will roll out some strategies. I will deploy some solutions, all those kinds of things. But it's exactly that. It's that triage concept. It's taking aggregate data to inform broadly, more narrowly defined to identify areas of concern, and then very detailed to identify specific solutions.
Or to identify things that we need to continue to enhance solutions for. Okay, so I've got one here and then one here, I think.
So I don't have the mic and repeat the question. So how do your clients access your dashboards? What is the IT setup? Are they on the same network or how do they access it?
So the question is, how do our clients access our dashboards? In this case, actually, our clients are internal account managers, and so that's all, I don't know all of the details fully, but it's maintained through our partnership with our IT function. So we don't have this available directly to clients today. So it's sort of a partnership where we'll have an account manager and myself or someone on this team that will share it with them. I think that is a direction that we're excited to potentially explore, but something that we're not at yet. And I have one here and then one over here, I think.
So you guys are doing a lot of data prep outside of Tableau. Do you think that any of the new features that are being rolled out will help you optimize your dashboard?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is, we're doing a lot of data prep outside of Tableau. Do we think that some of the new features being rolled out will be helpful? One, I'm very excited about Hyper. I mean, I want to check that out for sure. I'm hoping that we'll get there sooner rather than later on our versions that we're able to use. As far as some of the data prep, that is definitely something that we're open to, and it's kind of a constantly evolving thing. I have historically, in my time at Visa, been a little bit more of the perspective of doing a lot of that prep work outside of Tableau, because we are bringing in a fair number of tables and just the join functionality or the blending functionality. It works, but I just have a little bit more minute control over exactly what I'm doing in our Hadoop environment. And so we're able to hit the different, 1,000 different attributes and get the exact custom thing we need without bringing in as much into Tableau, since we are talking large volumes. But since we're getting toward hyper and the ability to work with more data faster, and some of the things I saw yesterday looked pretty cool. So I'm definitely going to check that out. I think I had one over here.
I think you mentioned it a little bit, but exposing this to customers directly, is this something that some customers might even want to pay for? Or would this be analytics that they would see really valuable in managing their business, and kind of cutting out that account manager and giving them the power of some of this data?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can't speak to the sales strategy. They haven't asked me on that too much, but I certainly see a huge amount of value in it. For me, it's tremendously useful insight, and just working directly with clients, I've seen them have a lot of value. But the other side of it is that, so I can see both sides, because there's huge value here, but the flip side is that, the way that Visa succeeds is by having our clients succeed. And so if it's helping our clients to get to the bottom of what's going on, and for people to feel safe using Visa cards, and for more traffic to flow through the Visa network, like we said, we don't issue the cards. The way that Visa is successful is for people to use the payment network. And so, I imagine that there's whole teams of people who would bounce back and forth the potential revenue implications of selling things versus making sure that people, love our service and that it's a seamless, safe environment. So,
but it's a challenge for us, because there's clearly monetary value. We could monetize this data, but we want to partner with our client institutions and deliver that performance advantage. We want to make ours the most attractive option in the market. We want to make our processing relationship the most attractive relationship. So we haven't settled on how best to kind of find that balance, because it's, on the one hand, yes, there's tremendous value in the data. On the other hand, there's also tremendous value in performance and in terms of delivering to the marketplace. Where the balance is, it's an evolving process.
We've got one here.
Just a bit of a general question, but what are some of the things that you had to do to ensure there was traction from your, I'll say, clients, so it's your internal clients. So we have a situation where my internal clients are the executives of our organization. Mm-hmm. We want to get something in front of them that gives them just the right amount of sort of interest, if you will, so that they don't just, say, okay, this isn't good, whatever. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we get it to them quickly. So what are some of the things you might have to do to be able to get that right amount of traction?
Yep, so the question was, what were some of the things we had to do to make sure that we're getting traction and that people are adopting this? I think there's a few things. I think the biggest thing from my perspective is that it comes down to making it as easy as possible. And what I mean by that is not just the access, everything like that, but what we did is we actually did sort of a mini roadshow. This is a new way of interacting that we've been doing at DPS, where we have a lot more direct access for our account managers, and the account managers don't necessarily have the experience in these tools. And so the roadshow was not just this is available, but it's this is available, this is why we think it's important, this is sort of how you use it, and then also building some sort of a support functionality in there. So we do kind of an office hours concept where we are just available for any sort of random drop-in questions. And we also tried to incorporate the ability, I'm pointing to my screen, you can't see, you tried to incorporate the ability to reach out directly from the dashboard. The other thing I think is really important, because I don't necessarily know if your executives are going to have the time to pop into office hours, but I think that it's really important to think through the audience. In this case, really had to fight our natural tendency to go deep because we really want to know the answers. And like this stuff, to some degree, it's kind of like, well, we kind of, like Rick said, we kind of know what we're going to see when we look at this, but not everybody knows what they're going to see when they look at this. And so we had to fight our natural tendency to want to jump immediately in and think about who the audience was and what they actually needed to know.
And ultimately, the success of data analytics is answering the right questions to produce actionable results. So my expertise is in what is the information that we need to know. Mark's expertise is in how to deliver it in a way that anyone can access. And then the results come from delivering the right questions with the right access and the right information in a way that doesn't require a great deal of technical expertise. So that's how we are leveraging data analytics to deliver accurate, timely, and actionable information to whatever the audience is, whether it's a senior audience, whether it's a client audience, whether it's internal audiences, there's any number. So I think that's the model that we are at least striving for to deliver that success.
The other thing I would say, and then I think we got time for a couple more if I don't ramble too much like I'm doing right now, is making sure that it stays fresh. And this is one of the things that I do like about us being able to work directly on our clusters and things is that our development cycle is sort of our own to a degree. Certainly if we put something into a production system that's completely fail-safe and everything like that, we have to work and partner with our IT teams. But it's something where if we decide that it's really important that we update this and add something new, we do it so that it's not something that people are kind of looking at and they say, old news, you did this 3 years ago. What have you done for me now? So yeah, I think we have time for a couple more. So. Yep.
You mentioned billions of rows. So do you see do you get performance issues on the Tableau side? And if you do, how do you tackle them?
I think it was a little close to the first. Did you ask? You said I mentioned performance issues, and have we seen any performance issues? And if so, how did we tackle them? The biggest thing that we did was making sure that we aggregated our data at the appropriate level. Like I mentioned, we're going from billions down to millions, and eventually down to thousands, actually, in this case. And so, while it's not as flexible now because we can't get to the other detail we left out, the biggest thing was just being kind of ruthless in the amount of data that we brought in because we know we want to specifically answer these questions, and so we only need this. And again, it's not as flexible, but it is fast. Yep.
So I was just curious, so I work within a large healthcare system, and leading our analytics group, we work a lot with our fraud, waste, and abuse group. Historically, they've had kind of a tougher time identifying some of the leading physician fraudulent activity. And so what we've been focusing on is how we can build out dashboards like this that answer a lot of the common questions we get or that they get. And I was just kind of curious how you went about identifying those common questions so you can make room for the SMEs to actually look at the emerging trends.
Okay, so the question was, how do we identify the right questions to ask and the right solutions to seek? And boy, that's a tough question because I don't want to sound, I'm looking at the room and I'm like the oldest guy in the room. And a lot of it is gray hair and time and experience. But to the extent that you or whoever you're representing understands what the business challenges are, that's the subject matter expertise that I try to bring to play. I know a lot about this world. I don't know much about this world. This guy knows a lot about this world. And so it's kind of this, Reese's peanut butter, chocolate and peanut butter, and it's great together. Because I can't do what he can do, he can't do what I can do, but together we can do a lot. I don't know how to answer that question specifically, but if you understand and identify what the threat profiles are of the business, then you understand how can I dimensionalize or access that information, and then what are the solutions available. And so you see it, you know what the options are, you distribute it, leverage it, and then you essentially are distributing the answers as well as the insights.
Yeah. I think one thing I'll add to it from my perspective as an analyst is, to a degree, I had to kind of, I'm not saying this is something you're dealing with, but to a degree, I kind of had to get past my own ego on it and realize that, what I really want to do, or my natural inclination, is to just let's get in and solve this whole thing again, and I'll get to it and I'll know the answer and I'll be an expert in it. But realizing that, maybe I could do that and I could take months to understand everything from the data that you can get from there, but I still wouldn't have all of the different kind of weird use cases and nuance that he knows. And so a lot of it was really partnering very closely with the business. I mean, I guess on the business side too, or on the business side, but with the business people who know what's going on, as opposed to my natural inclination, which is the only place I go for answers is the data, and he's used data too. So
This will be our last question.
okay.
Hey guys, so I'm seeing a lot of your graphs and everything are very issuer-centric. So I was wondering if you had acquirer-centric type items out there for your acquirer communities.
Okay, I'll take that. It's a great question asking about the acquiring side. And at the outset, we talked about DPS, issuer processing. That is our world. That's the world we live in. All of these same kinds of tools and same kind of techniques and the same kind of isolating what the threat matrix, the threat profiles are and what the solution sets are, all of that is in play on the acquiring side or the acceptance side of the business. I am not an expert in that area, so I will gracefully deflect the question, not that it's not being pursued, and addressed in much the same kind of, not the same set of solutions, but the same tools to deliver those answers. So it's a great question, and it's just a different line of business. And we could apply the same kinds of things to the doctor's example that we just had. We know our world, you know your world, and we are all here to deliver, to figure out how we can best. I mean, ultimately, information is an asset, and access to that information in a digestible way without having to have this gargantuan level of knowledge and technology and experience. If you can just exploit it through a simple tool like a dashboard, you're that much further along to solutions, and that's really what we're all about.
Well, thank you, Mark and Rick, very much.
And thank you all.
Thanks for coming, yeah.
We forgot to say there's a survey on the phone. And then
oh, yeah.
Yeah, do your survey.
Do your survey. I did a really bad job.
They're being recorded. Do your survey.
And if you do have any more questions, we'll be around for a bit after, so feel free to swing by.